In 2019, a team of geneticists sat in a university lab on a Thursday night, staring at a screen. They had been running comparisons for 6 weeks, 12 ancient populations. Samples pulled from archaeological sites across Africa and the Near East, Egypt, Nubia, Carthage, the Mali heartland, the Swahili coast. One by one, the results came back: partial matches, scattered signals, inconclusive overlaps. And then they ran the last comparison. The room went quiet, not because the data was broken, because it wasn't. Let's start with something that should sit uncomfortably in your mind for the next few minutes. 60% of African Americans have no documented family history before 1870. That's the year the first federal census counted formerly enslaved people by their actual names. Before that, nothing, a legal void. Generations reduced to property records, ship manifests, auction inventory, and often not even that. For millions of families, the question of where they came from before America is a blank wall with no door in it. DNA research is the first real crowbar anyone has taken to that wall. Starting in the early 2000s and accelerating sharply through the 2010s, geneticists began doing something that would have seemed like science fiction to the enslaved people themselves: reconstructing African origins with molecular precision, not from documents, not from oral memory, from the genetic material carried in every living cell of their descendants' bodies, intact and undeniable 4 and 5 generations after the last ship crossed the Atlantic. The Middle Passage couldn't erase that. Nothing could. Think for a moment about what the transatlantic slave trade actually did to human identity. Between 1619 and 1860, roughly 400,000 enslaved Africans arrived in what would become the United States. But those people didn't come from one place. They came from dozens of distinct nations, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, carrying different names, different cosmologies, different senses of who they were and where they fit in the world. The trade didn't care about any of that. Ships docked at specific ports along the West and Central African coastline, ports controlled by competing kingdoms, where people captured in wars or sold by rivals or seized by slave raiders were loaded onto vessels and sealed below deck. Once on board, identity was systematically destroyed, names erased and replaced with English ones, languages forbidden, families separated at the dock or at American auction blocks. By the time a person survived the Middle Passage and arrived in Virginia or South Carolina or Louisiana, everything that had marked them as Yoruba or Igbo or Wolof or Akan was under violent, sustained erasure. 2 centuries of that leaves a void that no archive can fill. But the body remembers. The most comprehensive genetic study to date was not one isolated experiment, but a converging wave of research that crested around 2020. The landmark paper came from geneticist Stephen Micheletti and a team at 23andMe, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. They analyzed the genomes of over 50,000 participants with documented African heritage across the Americas and mapped those signatures against reference populations spanning the full breadth of the African continent. What made this work genuinely distinct from earlier efforts was an additional layer. The researchers cross-referenced modern African American DNA against ancient population samples extracted from archaeological sites: teeth, skeletal remains, preserved tissue from burials ranging from several hundred to several thousand years old. They weren't just asking where modern African populations live now. They were asking which ancient peoples these genomes most closely echo across deep time. The civilizations on that comparison list were, more or less, the monuments of ancient African history. Ancient Egypt was first. It's always Egypt. Whenever African origin gets discussed in mainstream culture, the pyramids appear within minutes. Egypt is the default assumption, the obvious candidate. The place that, in the popular imagination, must be the ancestral home. Temples, pharaohs, a civilization so vast and enduring that it seems to contain everything. Ancient Nubia, the kingdom of Kush, was next. Nubia ruled Egypt for nearly a century during the 25th dynasty. Black kings on the Egyptian throne. The Kushite pharaohs built more pyramids than the Egyptians ever did in what is now Sudan. If you wanted a civilization with documented, undisputed, unambiguous black African power at its center, Kush was the strongest historical case anyone could make. Then the Mali Empire, the Swahili Coast kingdoms of East Africa. Carthage, the North African power that terrified Rome. The researchers were methodical. They wanted to close every door carefully, not blow past them. What they found upended the most common assumptions about this topic, and it did so with data, not argument. Ancient Egyptian DNA. When it was finally extracted and published from mummies studied in research that accumulated between 2017 and 2022, told a story that surprised almost everyone who had been operating on assumption rather than evidence. The ancient Egyptians of the Middle and New Kingdom periods showed genetic profiles most similar to ancient peoples of the Levant and Anatolia. Near Eastern. There was sub-Saharan African admixture in the signal. It was present, but it was not the dominant component. The people who built and maintained the great temple complexes, genetically speaking, were not primarily the ancestors of modern West Africans. And they were not, in any statistically meaningful way, the primary ancestors of African Americans. That finding doesn't diminish Egypt. It doesn't make the civilization less important or less extraordinary. It simply means the story is more complicated than the mythology that grew up around it. Ancient Nubia came closer. The Kushite populations showed stronger sub-Saharan African genetic components, as you would expect given the geographic and cultural overlap with the deeper interior of the continent. But even there, the match to African American DNA was partial. Significant in some family lines, weak in others, not the kind of consistent, dominant signal the researchers were looking for. Kush mattered. Kush was real. Kush just wasn't the core. Mali's genetic legacy, traced through modern Mandé-speaking populations scattered across the Sahel from Senegal to Guinea, showed meaningful overlap. West African ancestry is West African ancestry, and some portion of it does trace back to the great Sahelian empires. But the signal was diffuse, spread thin, strong in a subset of African American families, near absent in others. Egypt didn't match the way the mythology said it would. Nubia came close but wasn't the anchor. Mali was present but scattered. And then the researchers ran the comparison that almost no one had been talking about in mainstream conversations about African American heritage. The strongest match, by a margin the study's authors described as striking, was to the populations of what is now southwestern and southeastern Nigeria, specifically to the genetic profiles of the Yoruba people, the Edo people of the Benin Kingdom, and closely related groups from the coastal stretch of the Gulf of Guinea that Atlantic slave traders called, without ceremony, the Slave Coast. In the Micheletti study's findings, Nigerian ancestry accounted for approximately 38% of average African American genetic heritage. Not the largest slice in a complicated pie, a dominant signal. Across tens of thousands of genomes, nearly 4 in 10 parts of the typical African American sequence traced not to the Nile Valley, not to the Sudan, not to the Mali heartland, but to Nigeria, to Yorubaland, to the ancient city-states of the southwest and the river delta peoples of the southeast. The Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria, also heavily drawn into the Atlantic slave trade through the Bight of Biafra, represent the second largest genetic contributor to African American ancestry after the Yoruba. Together, these two Nigerian groups account for roughly half of the average African American genome. Not a trace, not a footnote in the margins. Half. Now, here is the part that most people genuinely don't know, and the part that makes this finding something much larger than a genealogy statistic. The Yoruba civilization is not a recent phenomenon. It is not a colonial-era construction. The city of Ile-Ife, located in what is now Osun State in southwestern Nigeria, is documented as one of the oldest continuously inhabited urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa. Archaeological evidence places complex settlement there at least as far back as 500 BCE. Some researchers trace cultural continuity to the Nok civilization, which flourished across central Nigeria, roughly from 1500 BCE to 300 CE, and which produced the oldest known terracotta sculpture in sub-Saharan Africa. Figures with hollow eyes, intricate hairstyles, detailed human and animal forms that archaeologists have been puzzling over since their discovery in the 1940s. Ife is not just old in a geological sense. In Yoruba tradition, it is the center of the world. The place where Oduduwa descended from the sky on an iron chain and poured sand onto the primordial waters. From Ife, all legitimate royal lineages extend outward like spokes from a hub. Every Yoruba king traces his authority back to that city. This is not mythology at war with science. This is two different ways of recording the same deep truth, that this place, this people, this civilization carries enormous age and weight. The Benin Kingdom, the Edo people, neighbors and kin to the Yoruba, had established one of the most administratively sophisticated pre-colonial states in human history by at least the 13th century, and certainly by the 15th. Benin City had wide paved tree-lined boulevards organized on a rational grid, a system of earthen walls and moats stretching hundreds of miles that a Dutch traveler in the early 17th century compared favorably to Amsterdam in scale and planning. The palace complex was enormous. The royal court maintained a bureaucracy, a professional military, a guild system for artists and craftsmen who produced, among other things, the Benin bronzes. Thousands of intricately cast metal plaques and royal portrait heads depicting court life in extraordinary detail, using a lost wax technique of such precision that European scholars initially refused to believe Africans had made them. Bronzes are now in the British Museum, the Smithsonian, the Ethnologisches Museum in Berlin. Taken by British troops during the punitive expedition of 1897, when the Empire sacked the city and burned the palace. They have been argued over, requested back, partially returned, partially retained, ever since. The people whose art fills European museums, the people whose DNA fills African American genomes. That connection was never supposed to be traceable. The slave trade was designed, among its other functions, to make ancestry invisible. Rename the person, forbid the language, separate the family, erase the origin point. What you cannot name, you cannot claim. What you cannot claim, you cannot use to build resistance, solidarity, identity, pride. Understanding why the Nigerian genetic signal is so dominant also requires understanding that the slave trade's geography was not random and not evenly distributed across the continent. The Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra. The coastal regions of modern Nigeria, the Republic of Benin, Togo, and Ghana were among the highest volume slave trading zones in the entire Atlantic system across 2 centuries of operation. Between the early 17th century and the American ban on the slave trade in 1808, these ports exported millions of people. The flow from the Bight of Biafra, dominated by Igbo-speaking people from the Nigerian interior, fed heavily into Virginia and Maryland. Chesapeake planters developed specific preferences, recorded in their own correspondence, for enslaved people from particular African ports. The cruelty of that specificity 2 centuries later is that it created a traceable pattern. What the slavers documented as a commercial preference, geneticists can now read as a geographic signature. There is a woman in Atlanta. Her name doesn't matter, because she is also 1,000 other people, whose grandmother told her every Sunday that their family was from somewhere royal. No country, no name, just somewhere royal, somewhere important before. The grandmother had gotten it from her grandmother, who had gotten it from hers. A whisper that had been passed forward through generations that couldn't attach itself to any specific geography, because there was no paper trail to anchor it to. Look, nothing to find. She took a DNA test last year. The results said Yoruba, Edo, the Bight of Benin region, the territory of the old Benin Kingdom, the kingdom with the bronze art, the kingdom with the city walls, the kingdom with the royal court her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother had somehow carried forward in the only form available to her, which was a feeling. Her grandmother was right. She just didn't have the language to be more precise about it. This is what this research is doing, quietly and at scale, for millions of families. It isn't building a new mythology. It isn't telling people what they want to hear. It is filling in the actual contours of a severed history with molecular evidence. And what it is revealing is not what popular culture expected or what the most common narratives about African American ancestry had pointed toward. Nobody built a major blockbuster franchise around the Yoruba. The Benin Kingdom doesn't occupy the same space in the American cultural imagination that ancient Egypt does. But science doesn't negotiate with popular expectations. The data keeps giving the same answer. This is where the strongest signal lives. This is the ancient civilization that matched. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in 1838, wrote in his autobiography that he did not know his own age. He had been kept deliberately ignorant of it. He didn't know his father with certainty. He knew almost nothing of where his mother's people had come from before Maryland. He wrote about that absence with a precision that is almost unbearable. The way not knowing becomes its own specific wound, one that can't close because there is nothing to close it with. What would it have meant to him to know? To know that the people whose genome he carried had built life when ancient Rome was in its infancy, that the artisans who cast the Benin bronzes were his kin, that the Yoruba oral tradition, one of the richest and most complex literary traditions in the world, was in some deep molecular sense his tradition too. He couldn't have known. The whole apparatus of what was done to him was designed to make sure he couldn't. But now we can. The genome is a record that no one could burn, no one could confiscate, no one could forbid or auction off. It traveled inside the bodies of people who survived the Middle Passage. It passed through their children and their children's children, generation after generation, carrying its information forward without anyone's permission, without anyone's knowledge, waiting for a moment in history when someone would have both the tools and the will to read it. That moment turned out to be now. And the answer it keeps returning is one that changes what it means to know where you came from. If this landed somewhere in you, if you've been carrying this question or carrying it for someone in your family, put it in the comments. Not a debate about methodology, just what does it mean to you to hear this? Because the research doesn't stop at the edge of the laboratory. It keeps traveling, the way the DNA did. The next piece goes deeper into the Benin Kingdom specifically, what the city actually looked like at its height, how the kingdom governed, what the bronzes were really for, and what happened in 1897 when the British arrived, and what was taken that still hasn't come back. If you want to be there for that one, you know what to do.